When you sell to a tax-exempt customer, we exempt tax from the transaction. If you expect a transaction to be exempt, but we still added tax, you need to figure out why. Under Customer Info, we tell you if an entity use code was included on the transaction. Entity use codes tell us your customer's exemption reason, which we use to determine if they're exempt from the tax where the transaction took place. If a customer exemption number was included on the transaction, it would appear in the blank space under the customer code. To learn more, watch our video on troubleshooting customer exemption numbers. You can also include entity use codes on specific line items. This transaction doesn't have an entity use code, so the first step is to add one. If it doesn't fix the problem, the next step is to review the entity use code's taxability. If you repeatedly have a problem with entity use codes not appearing on your transactions, you should solve the problem at its source. If you have an integration connecting your business application to Avalara, make sure it's properly configured to include entity use codes on your transactions. If you import your transactions into Avalara, make sure your import file includes entity use codes in the correct format. You can also add an entity use code to a transaction that's already in your Avalara account. To add an entity use code to a specific line item, edit the line item. To add an entity use code to the full transaction, edit the document details. Select your customer's entity type from the dropdown. Then save the document details. Tax is still being added to the transaction. You need to recalculate tax on the transaction for the changes to take effect. The tax amount didn't change. Let's take a closer look at how to figure out what's going on. Under Customer Info, it says that the entity use code for charitable organizations is being applied to the transaction. In this example, the transaction took place in North Carolina, so North Carolina's tax laws apply. North Carolina doesn't exempt tax on sales to charitable organizations, so sales tax is correctly being added to this transaction. For a full list of exemption reasons each state accepts, go to the Exemption Reason Matrix in the Avalara Knowledge Center. If you realize that you're using the wrong entity use code for your customer, you can update it. Remember, the entity use code must match your customer's actual exemption reason. Let's see what happens when you change the code to resale. The tax amount still hasn't changed. That's because in order for the changes to take effect, you need to recalculate tax on the transaction. In this example, the tax amount drops to 0 because resale is an accepted exemption reason in North Carolina. Make sure you save the transaction before leaving the page. Let's review. You identified the problem. You added an entity use code. You reviewed the entity use code's taxability. Then you recalculated tax on the transaction. Remember, when you recalculate taxes in your Avalara account, the updated tax amounts do not automatically flow back to your business application. Instead, you need to manually make the updates so that the tax amounts match. This important step makes it easier to reconcile your sales information each month.